disordered gambling, and to also offer support, treatment, and hope to the problem gambler and their families. And we have our 800 Gambler Helpline, which we are so proud of. It's on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for those who are in need of help. So the objectives of this workshop is to understand how intergenerational trauma impacts your clients. I know I did this presentation a couple of weeks ago for the National Council, and people said, well, how do I find out about these things? Well, this is what I'm going to educate you on today, and to be able to give you some resources so that when you do have a client from another racial group or other than your own, you will know how to understand some of the things that they may say or their reactions to you. To understand how the current events have impacted your clients, whether they've had this experience themselves, or it's just through hearing about it and referred trauma, so to speak. And we're going to understand how you can validate your clients. Oops, sorry. So in the spirit of Ubuntu, which is an African proverb, I am because we are. And as far as educating people on diversity, we have to actually live it, and we have to embrace each other so that we can model good behavior. So I am because we all are. So you've heard, I'm sure, over the past year, you've heard of diversity, equity, inclusion. I chair the committee with the National Council on Diversity, Equity, Inclusion. And what we do is we want to educate people on the range of human differences. And that could be anything from race, ethnicity, social status, religion, age. I know as I age gracefully, there are certain stumbling blocks in the way, and people assume that because you're of a certain age that there are things that you can't do. And I always like to show them what I can do. And despite my age, I am 66, so I am considered a senior. And sometimes my staff reminds me of that. My son calls me boomer. Okay, so equity, everyone wants to be treated fair, impartially, and we should have equal rights for all, because isn't that what this country was founded on? Inclusion, has to do with human rights, equal access for everyone. Right now, there are disparities in certain communities in regard to the COVID-19 pandemic. And many states, I know in the city of Philadelphia, they are targeting those areas that otherwise would be ignored, or those individuals would have to travel outside of their communities to be able to get the same things that those of us who can drive, et cetera, can get to. And every human being wants to feel a part of. A lot of people will say, well, I don't care or whatever, but we always want to be feel a part of. So when you're, as helpers, those of us in the field, we need to look at people through a trauma-informed lens. You don't necessarily, you want to know who are you? Where did you come from? What happened? To respect their ethnicity, the worst thing you can do is assume, or even add things that you may not be sure of. I always let my client tell me who they are, as opposed to my biases getting in the way. Who are you? I mean, you could look a certain way, but that doesn't mean that you are. And African Americans in particular are of many hues. Some of us are very, very light skinned and almost look white. And some of us are very, very dark. So you have to respect, find out who they are. Who do you identify as? I don't want to alienate them in the first session. And we always want to give people the unconditional positive regard. I guess if I was to classify my therapeutic skills, I say slash Rogerian, Freudian kind of, I want to know what happened to you. I want to know what's going on. And then I might shift to cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, this workshop is really geared to everyone. You don't have to be a clinician. You just need to be a human being to be able to understand some of the things that I'm going to bring up today. So the key ingredients for trauma-informed care is to be able to lead and communicate, engage people in planning, especially your clients if you're working with clients. Train all staff. I know I have tried to do that with the team. I call them a team that I work with. Just being able to educate them on who I am, because I have in the skin experience. So I try to let them know. Create a safe environment where people feel safe to be able to communicate how they're feeling. And screen for trauma. You want to know, like I said, what happened? So I'm going to ask you to keep an open mind. A lot of people feel guilty over some of the things that went on in our history, but it's not your guilt. It's what we need is your awareness and understanding, because it's not your guilt to have. You didn't do these things. And to notice your feelings. If, what does this emote in you? So, as I said before, you might look at an African American and you'll say, okay, well, this is their experience, when not everybody has the same experience. So we're going to talk about that today. So this is me when I was probably about 7 years old and didn't know what was going on in the world, except for where I lived. And where I lived was during the when I was home, everybody was African American, and I was pretty much accepted. But when I left the home, I wasn't. My parents, in their quest to give me a better life, give me a better education. My father was a doctor. We moved into an area where we were the only Black family. And a lot of times I know when we listen to people and they'll say, well, when I was a kid, this happened or that happened. Realize that there's something to that. There's something that you're remembering that's making you say that. For instance, it might seem trite to you guys, but I remember standing in line and the boys saying, oh, don't come near me, your Blackness is going to rub off, or you have cooties. Or when we would have square dancing class, the boys wouldn't square dance with me. They didn't want to touch me. And so I had to square dance with the teachers. Some of the teachers were racist as well, not allowing me to participate in certain things. And when you grow up like that, it's traumatic, and you form ideas. And when there are so many people who don't understand your journey or understand what's going on with you, that you have a tendency to say, okay, well, that didn't really happen, or is there something wrong with me? And I think a lot of us go through that all of our lives thinking, oh, do we make too much of this? Or is it, are we mistaken? Because a lot of people will say we're playing the race card or whatever. But I can tell you from firsthand experience, this was my journey. And it might be a little different because I had different things than some people. I grew up in an affluent area and my father was a doctor. So like I said before, you have to understand people's stories. And then we, as people living the story, have to be able to embrace what happened and be able to work through it. So we're going to talk about two different communities today. Those that were brought in as slaves, and those who are Native Americans who were traumatized by the Europeans to get their land and things like that. So we're going to talk about these two communities. Just to give you a little bit of heads up on what PTSD, it's a psychiatric disorder. It occurs in people who've experienced or witnessed a traumatic event, such as natural disaster, a serious incident, sexual, and now I would include racial, or serious injury, or even been exposed to seeing something that happened, even if it didn't happen directly to you. It destroys one's normal capacity for coping. You're always wondering, am I really feeling this? Is this really going on? And it affects the psyche and the soul. These wounds you'll never see. These wounds are inside. So these are the different things, different kind of disorders that, or actually feelings that might emote from PTSD, flashbacks, fear, hypervigilance, avoidance. You don't want to talk about it. Just keep it buried. So it's intense feelings of distress, and it happens after the event. It's not going on during the event. During the event, you're coming up with ways to cope. And that's why when we talk about working with people using cognitive behavioral therapy, what we're doing is we're trying to confront those, those coping mechanisms that worked at one time, but they don't work any longer. The memories are invasive. Some people have flashbacks and nightmares and loss of interest in life, depression. Feelings, a lot of people will cut because they are numb to what has happened in their lives, and so they want to feel something, and so they'll cut. Avoiding different activities or smells. And one of the more serious ways that people cope is through dissociation. People who were involved in the 9/11 catastrophe, a lot of them have dissociative qualities where aren't necessarily, it's like an out of body experience. So when we deal with complex PTSD, this is something that happens over and over and over again. So like a child being abused, or genocide campaigns, which goes on in the country today. When you are devalued over and over and over again, or what the things that you see, individuals being harmed because of the color of their skin, people being harmed because of them speaking out. So that is, constant rejection can lead to complex PTSD. And there's a lot of feelings of shame, relationship difficulties, and they have a tendency to cut themselves off from others. So what is intergenerational trauma? It's a term that describes trauma that can be transferred in between generations. And it's almost like when people say, well, I'm an alcoholic because my father was an alcoholic. And then those isms continue to carry. That's almost the same as intergenerational trauma. And what it is that as a generation who has been traumatized, we tend to pass it on to our children as a way of coping. And you're going to see that as we go along, you'll see that kind of unfold for you. So when I was doing this, I had a hard time with it because some of the pictures that I'm about to show you triggered me. When I see something that has, my background is African-American. I identify as an African-American, but I'm also Native American and I have ancestors from everywhere. But those are the two that I know about and that I've studied about and things like that. So when I've heard of these atrocities, for some reason, it just emotes something in me. And I kind of triggered myself doing this. So we want to talk about what happened to cause this trauma. Okay, African Americans, we're going to talk about them first. They were captured. Could you imagine you're a prince in your country and you're captured and you're shipped to another country and then sold as property, beaten, experimented on, and separated from your family? And these are the kind of, this is what was given to people, these kind of, physical atrocities. So many times when people were brought over from Africa, because they weren't slaves when they were brought over here, they were human beings. They were put in a hull of a ship and they were considered property. So if the ship was too heavy and they were throwing off, say, gold or whatever else they had taken from Africa, they would toss over some of the Africans as well, and they just drowned in the ocean. So could you imagine traveling in such a way where you're laying down, no place to go to the bathroom, and having to deal with that type of atrocity? And this is an example of property. Here's a public sale where they're selling off 3 Negro men, 4 women, 1 boy, and some children. And in the next comma, 12 to 15 head of horses, 1 yoke of oxen. So African Americans were treated that way. And basically, my experience, I would say that the type of family that I come from were people who came from the South, who what we call sometimes that Negro experience as they were growing up. And so these things are passed on. This is an example of another type of atrocity. I don't have this in my slides, but many Africans, after they were, or once they became slaves, if they died, their skin and their skin was made into pocketbooks, wallets, and things like that. So they would tan the hides and of the skin, and that would happen. There's also this thing called alligator bait, where babies were put out down in the swamp areas to draw in the alligator so that they could get the meat from the alligator or the hide. It was very horrendous, and sometimes the babies would die and sometimes the babies would live. So there's little black licorice nibs, and it is said that it was the ad would read a dainty little morsel for decades. So the candy was almost referred to as nigger babies, and the name was later changed to nibs, and it's still on the market today. So people say African Americans should just forget about it. How do you forget about things like this? It's not that you dwell on it, but it's a part of who you are. So slavery ended on June 19th, and that's Freedom Day. It's like 4th of July. And many of us didn't know this until time went on, especially if we grew up in the North, because it was mostly a Southern celebration that was then brought up north. So characteristics of intergenerational trauma: you'll have complex trauma, depression, self-hatred. Self-hatred is the most, I'd say, the hardest thing to get over or to change. because we were taught to hate ourselves, and we were taught to hate each other, especially when, if say the slave master had a particular slave that he enjoyed, and she had children, and those children were light skinned, they would work in the house, and that was an easier job sometimes than having to do the backbreaking work of the slaves that worked in the fields. So there was a separation that, you know, if you're light skinned, you worked in the house, and if you were dark skinned, you worked in the fields. So it grew a separation from us, and I'll go on further to tell you why a lot of times African Americans don't trust. They don't even trust each other, and I'll go on to speak more about that. Like I said, these invisible wounds. A lot of things that went on, it's almost like pre-verbal trauma. If you've ever studied trauma, the younger, say if a child is molested or beaten and they're pre-verbal, they don't have the words to talk about how they felt. And that's the way it is with a lot of African Americans. There are no words. Like somebody will say, well, what is it like? You know, sometimes I don't have the words, because sometimes I'm not allowed to even voice those words. And so those feelings have been stuffed. And these are life-altering experiences. Why else would I remember what the boys said to me in high school or in elementary school when I was so young? And, you know, I could go on and on with that, but I'm not going to. I'm going to continue to move forward. So there's this thing called epigenetics, and some people agree with it where others don't. And it's a modification. It's inherited, and it's passed on from parent to offspring in a phenomenon that is generally referred to as epigenetic inheritance, or passed down through multiple generations via transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. So it's like it's mapped. It's mapped. And a lot of times people will say, well, where did you get that from? Or where'd that understanding come from? You can't even say where it came from. You might have heard it, or it might have gone on in the family, but it's something that's continually carried on. Something that, as far as intergenerational trauma goes, a lot of individuals will say, well, why are African Americans so harsh on their children? And it's because if the children cried or disturbed or anything like that, the whole family would get in trouble. It wouldn't just be that child. So the mothers and the fathers had to keep the children in line, had to make sure that they didn't cry out or cause a scene. So let's talk about the aftermath of slavery. African Americans could marry, because before then they couldn't marry. And if the slave master wanted to come and take the woman away from the hut or away from her partner and use her for fun with his friends up at the slave master's home, that was done. So at least now they had the right to marry. They could own property. They could sue each other in court, but they could never sue a white person. Brutality of slavery, and they were able to, well, they no longer lived through were experiencing the brutality of slavery, and they received wages. Now, things couldn't be, prejudice continued to persist, and it persists till today. Couldn't testify against a white person. Oh no, I come from a generation where you didn't talk back, and because of that, we rebelled through the 60s and 70s. So we weren't taught that you should speak up. Serve on juries, couldn't serve on juries, couldn't vote. Different water fountains, sit at the back of the bus, and as you all know about Rosa Parks. And we certainly couldn't date outside of our race, because Even if African-American male looked at a white woman, he could be killed. One of the famous, famous because of what happened, is Emmett Till. He was brutally beaten, hung, all kinds of things were atrocities were put on him because he happened to, he was accused of rape and because he was looking at a white woman. So definitely couldn't date outside of race, or you would be lynched. And some lynchings still go on today. So this is what a sharecropper family looked like. They bartered with the slave owners so that they could still keep a part of their property, and they could raise crops and give them some of it, but it never was enough for them to get out of their situation. This is one of the very reasons why African Americans don't want the coronavirus vaccine. The Tuskegee syphilis study, it lasted from 1932 to 72. So that was 40 years that African-American men, there were 600 of them, and 399 of them had latent syphilis. So we're not talking about initial onset. We're talking about latent, where things like, you can go crazy, so to speak, and you died. But they were told they were given medication, and they weren't. They were given a placebo. And 201 who were not affected. And they kind of both gave them the same placebo. But they knew darn well that these people who had the latent syphilis were going to die. They were promised free medical care. And Eunice Rivers was an African-American nurse who went out. She would recruit these men, and then she would give them this medication that wasn't going to help. Now, if you don't know about this story, there is a movie called Miss Evers' Boys, and you can find out more information. There's so much in my references of different stories that you can look at. So a lot of times African Americans will feel devaluated. They were stripped of their essentials, of their humanity. It's a slow moving cancer that distorts one's life. Paralyzing. You feel humiliated, you feel shame. If, a lot of times we say things to people and we don't understand what they might mean, or even if you think that you're trying to identify, you have to be careful, because that could be seen as offensive. And I know that I've heard people say, well, you shouldn't be so sensitive to something that's been going on for over 300 years. I might want to argue that fact. So the civil rights movement was awesome. There were so many people. In fact, Bernie Sanders was a part of the civil rights movement. Representative Lewis was part of the civil rights movement. And of course, Martin Luther King. So when we look at a picture like this, isn't this pretty reminding us of what went on just this year, where people, because they knew that they wanted to make a change and that they wanted to have a voice, they got in line and they wanted to vote. They wanted to have these new privileges. And it wasn't just for African Americans, but, the NAACP and the civil rights movement worked really for all people. So loss of identity. Now I can tell you, since I was a little girl, I've been called a Negro, I've been called colored, I've been called Black, and I've been called African American, amongst other names. But who do I identify with? A lot of our religious and cultural beliefs were taken away. A lot of the slaves did not follow Christianity. So it was taken away, or not slaves, I shouldn't say that, because they weren't slaves at a time. Given slave names. So you walk around constantly saying, well, who am I? So in some trauma, I can give you this instance that was noted by Dr. Joy DeGroy. I've also put a number of her videos on, in my references, where a white mother will say about her child, well, my child is wonderful, he's bright, and things like that. Where the first thing an African-American mother will say, well, he's not in jail. He's a good boy. He's not in jail. He's not doing drugs. He's taking care of his children. Instead of just saying, yes, he is. But that's passed on because we couldn't talk up our child or our child would be taken away from us. So we couldn't be really like all that proud and things like that. You have to tell your son to be careful of the police. Don't trust the white man, or the doctor, or anybody else. So today's issues, ancestors took it. We're not taking it anymore. There's rage. There are things that are going on right now that have to do with systemic racism and legalized racial discrimination. But we can't forget. And next week, I was talking to another colleague of mine, and she was saying, well, we have to. Next week, they're having the George Floyd hearings. So I know that a lot of people are on guard because of that. Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Trayvon Martin. Those are names that have happened in the last couple of years to make us understand that it's not always the person's fault. It's discrimination, and it has to do with the system. And again, helplessness, and I won't vote. What does it matter? Like I said, invisible wounds, maladies and wounds that have no name, trauma, rape. You know, African-American women are seen as super women. And there's also education and health disparities. And that's why, you know, you'll see a lot of African-Americans, they don't trust the vaccine. They'll say, oh, well, they're experimenting on us. So when people say Black Lives Matter, they are not saying that no other lives matter besides Blacks. They're saying really all lives matters. But until Black lives matter and Native American lives matter, Asian and so on, then all lives don't matter. So we all have to matter to each other. So I know, well, what happens when we've been traumatized? A lot of times the trauma is deep down, but the way it will manifest itself is through drugs, alcohol, difficult behaviors that we may have obtained along the way. But this is how it looks. The trauma stays buried because, as you know, me being 66, things come back, you know, or I have a flashback or something over something that happened. So a lot of times what we'll do is look outside of ourselves to make ourselves feel better. And that's what happens with gambling, alcohol, other substances. So African Americans have twice the rate of disordered gambling compared to whites. Black and disordered gamblers were significantly less likely than their white counterparts to have a lifetime alcohol use disorder. So it's very comorbid. So for those of you who may not understand that term, that means that, okay, so while I'm at the casino, I'm not just playing the game, I'm also drinking. So you have to look at what that all brings about. Not only is that feeding another addiction, but it also is an issue with the public health. For instance, a person may have an accident, a DUI, things like that. So as you can see, it's all interrelated. And I suggest to my colleagues in the field, we can't continue to work in silos. We've got to work together because all of these issues are interconnected. And of course, we're less likely to go for help of any kind. It's just something that doesn't, especially mental health. And that's what we're trying to change in those communities. So now with move over to the Native Americans, the peaceful Pilgrims massacred and destroyed the fort near Stoddington in Connecticut. So when a lot of people don't want to celebrate Thanksgiving as a historical event because of this reason. I was at a conference in Vegas and I just sat in the audience, and this is where I say I'm sensitive, like I can feel almost like I'm a sensitive, individual. So I feel when I sat in the audience and I heard this gentleman talk about the Carlisle boarding schools, I had never heard about it before. And this was just a few years ago. How it was opened, and it was, kids from 6 to 25 went there, and they were sent there to be civilized, to become acculturated to the white world. They were stripped of their heritage, stripped of their values, their hair, all those kind of things. And there's 186 graves on these boarding schools. And if you made it out alive, you were scarred for the rest of your life. And a lot of times you didn't make it out alive. But there are many, many resources that you can find out about. So as I said, they were given harsh punishment. They were raped. There was one story that the gentleman from Wellbriety who gave this presentation talked about how there was a child, his grandmother or one of his ancestors was speaking in her native tongue to her friend, and they took her in a room and cut off her finger. Well, she was caught again and again and again. And it took losing all 5 of her fingers to understand that she shouldn't speak her language. They were also given new names and new clothes. So when we talk about gambling, when it comes to Native Americans, it's similar to the rate of non-Native Americans in the US. Now, what you have to remember is that it's hard to get accurate information on marginalized communities because they don't always present. So a lot of these rates may be higher, or I would suggest that they're probably higher. And there's also a higher rate of alcohol abuse than their white counterparts. And then most of you are aware, if you work in the gambling field, about the Indian Gaming Regularity Act. And that had to do with the tribal nations now being able to own casinos and use a portion of it to help their community. So you've heard me talk about maladaptive behaviors. These are the ways we cope with trauma: through gambling, through drugs, through alcohol, domestic violence, rage. So when you're talking to your client, or when you're really just talking, when you say, I don't see color, how could you not, of course you see color. Because if you say you don't see color, you don't see me, because I am who I am. Presumed criminality. Just because you see that an African American was around there does not mean that they are criminals. Oh, you don't look or sound. I get that all the time when I'm on the phone. Oh, you don't sound black. They deserved it. And I think everybody has a tendency when you see, oh, so-and-so was shot down. Well, what'd they do? Sometimes they didn't do anything. Telling us to get over it. And that racism doesn't exist anymore. That is, or I have a whole bunch of black friends, so how could I be racist? So when you're talking about trauma, and I would say that if you do any of these type of strategies, you need to be educated. For instance, exposure therapy is not something that every clinician should be doing. They should be well versed in that. EMDR, and it has to do with eye rapid eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And I don't understand it, but I know that there are some clinicians that do. And it's really like going like this back and forth in front of your eyes. CBT is just confronting flawed thinkings. And there are medications that treat symptoms, but they don't necessarily get rid of the trauma. So the trauma is really always there. It's if we can. Now, I saw this picture and it speaks to so many different things. It speaks to his ethnicity. It speaks to his poverty, which a lot of African Americans suffer with, and other marginalized communities. And he's invisible. It's hard and it hurts to be invisible. So that's my conclusion. Really, this could be an all-day workshop to be able to understand all the nuances. I became interested in this when I was in my master's program, and I don't know if any of you might know Dr. Ange Pui. He has a trauma practice in the state of New Jersey. He was one of my professors at Chestnut Hill, and he gave me a movie done by Dr. Kenneth Hardy, and that speaks to the psychological residuals of slavery. But as I said, I have so many different things that you can educate yourself on as far as reference is concerned. And thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me today.
Ms. Neva, thank you very much. That was great. We had some information on the chat. Someone had requested some information regarding who was the whistleblower of the TUSKEGEE syphilis study. Okay. Now, I responded to Mr. Rodrigo and telling him it was Peter Buxton.
Oh, thank you, Louise.
No problem. Also, you know, there was a big article because there was a lot of people denying this, but there was a big article in the Times in 1972. So it wasn't until 1972 that this was really pushing, you know, really studied. And to this day, you know, people don't really know every situation. You know, all the people that were actually left to suffer. You know, the 600 men of the over 200 just left to suffer. Although, you know, there was treatment available. Penicillin had already been invented. You know, so if there's anything that you can say,
well, there's also many there's many different studies that were done on African Americans, especially women. You know, there was one because the woman had a huge behind, they studied her, or you know, a woman's ovaries, and then they're just left to die. So it's you live in a world where you don't trust anybody, and you don't trust each other because, case in point, Miss Evers' boys.
Yes. Now, Ms. Neva, in your presentation, one of the things that you mentioned in the beginning was, you know, person saying, you know, or finding out who they are. Mm-hmm. That is a very difficult question. Mm-hmm. You know, not many people are able to answer that question. Is there some kind of anything that you can suggest where you can, those individuals who are treatment providers are able to help the client go along where they can find out or guide the client into find out who they are?
Well, my family, we did the legacy, the ancestry.com, and you know, it says you're from all different places, but when it comes down to it, you're not sure. You're of so many different nationalities. Most of us are just seen as African Americans, you know, and we're not allowed to embrace anything else. We were told if you have a drop of Black blood in you, that you're, you know, that's who you are. But research, like I said, go and research and find out about these things, and then bring it to your client. You know, if you find out that a client has a particular, even, I mean, I just like to put love of cars. Well, maybe you should find out a little bit about that so that you can speak to your client about that. You know, because you never know. Why do you love cars? Is it because my father did this in the car, or I might have been molested in a car? You know what I mean? It's just, you have to find out where they're coming from.
Almost definitely. Also, you know, so as you spoke, one of the things came to me when you said that within a family, sometimes they identify themselves in a certain way.
Mhm.
Words are powerful.
Yes.
You know, the words we tell ourselves, the word we tell our loved one, the words the parents tell their children.
Mhm.
If you can go in a little bit into that of, you know, how these negative words can affect you in the long run and decision to make in your life.
Um, it's very, you know, like I said before, trying to figure out these things, um, trying to think of who I am. How did I get here? I was kind of distracted by a chat that came up. I'm sorry.
Sometimes that happens.
Can you answer the question? Can you ask the question again? I'm sorry.
No, I was just saying it wasn't a question. It's more or less, you know, if you can basically, you know, give more information on how important words are. You know,
Oh, yes.
how a
Okay.
person describes themselves.
Yes, it is very important because some people, I mean, you know, I was listening to a video before I came on where a lot of people, you know, when I was a kid, you better not call me black. That was like the worst. And how if we talk about each other, we'll say, oh, that black so and so, or that black this one. So that's how we re-trigger ourselves. But then, you know, when Caucasians say things to African Americans, um, it, it's very difficult because you're not sure. You question yourself. Is this a racist statement or what? And a lot of times you let things go because you're afraid to say things, you know, for fear of maybe I'm making too much of this. No, you hurt me. You know, and people need to realize that. I was really neglectful in saying that this is Problem Gambling Awareness Month. That's the purpose of these videos. And also, we just got finished with um, uh, the African American Historical Month, where, you know, really should be every month. And also, we'll be celebrating Women's Month. I think I saw somebody in the chat came and said, is race listed in DSM-5 as part of the disorder? I have to tell you that I really don't know. I'd have to look at that, but I don't think so. But it does give you all of the traumatic um, symptoms that we spoke about are listed as what trauma is. And really, trauma is unique to everyone. For instance, I might have gone through the same thing as my sister, but my sister may not be traumatized by it, but I was.
Right. No, it's very much important to be able to let people who be they are and respect people for who they are.
Mm-hmm.
You have to give them that. And this all comes down to being part of like for treatment providers and people in mental health. This comes down to being culturally, you know, competent,
Competent.
becoming aware. Yes, Mr. Dan was talking about, you know, like nowadays, how many incidents you hear in the news about people who are Asian being taught
Right.
because people believe that they're the one that started the
Mhm.
pandemic.
Exactly. But that was perpetuated through, um, you know, being called the China virus and things like that. So, like I said, speech matters. What we say to an individual, not that we, I mean, there's some, you know, you have your friends who you don't have to, you know, be so cautious around, but there are some people that you know, but I think, you know, to me, it might be common sense that you just wouldn't say something like that to somebody, but you never know. But, you know, I value diversity. I try to put the council in every community in the state of New Jersey. I want to make sure that every ethnicity is represented, every race, every creed, and you know for yourself, Luis will find others to take the cockfighting brochure to the cockfights.
Yes.
Because people need to know too.
Listen, you know, how many times do we talk about, you know, or do we submit forward, start a conversation?
Right.
You know, gambling is not called a hidden addiction for anything, you know, it's for no reason.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason why it's called that. And it doesn't matter, you know, the race, your ethnicity, you know, your economic standing, your social standing, it doesn't matter. You know, anyone can fall victim to this addiction.
Right.
You know, but today, you know, like you said, this month, March, is problem gambling awareness.
Right.
So we need to promote this. We need to let people know that this disease is treatable. There's no need for them to suffer on their own.
And I think the thing that excites me the most is that we have treatment providers that are bilingual, speak Spanish. We have now a new provider who is of Asian descent. And to me, it's the most exciting thing because I know that I can treat all the problem gamblers, not just a particular class, but all problem gamblers, women, men, children. We're trying to go with several new initiatives that we hope to come out with soon. So to address this very thing. I think
yes, ma'am. You know, and I'm glad you brought that up because, you know, I do presentations all over the place. And a lot of time, the misconception is that men are the gambler ones, you know, that is men. But people don't know that, you know, 47% of all gamblers are women.
Yes.
You know, especially look at Florida. Florida specific, the Florida Council put out all this information. Mm-hmm. How, you know, the large number of the female population, especially going into the senior years, our elders. There's a lot of women gamblers.
Yes.
So you know, this disease is not, you know, isolated to men.
And seniors. I mean, I could tell you most of my friends are retired because they went into the state or, you know, had jobs like that. And I'm telling you, I've known some of them who've gone through their whole pension. And we get calls all the time at the council on, you know, my mother spent all her pension. Now what do I do?
Yes, and this is why we're here.
Mm-hmm.
That's why our numbers is here. That's why we know we as an individual, you know, if you just want information regarding this disease, because like I said, it can affect anyone at any time. Give us a call.
Yes. Give
us a call and we'll give you information. You don't have to wait until this disease has affected someone in your family.
Right.
People that want this information.
And the reason that I want diversity when it comes to especially our treatment providers is a lot of times different groups identify with their own. Now, I can tell you when I was a kid, it was exciting to see somebody on TV that was African-American. Oh my God, the phone rang off the hook. There's a colored man, at that time we were called colored. There's a colored man on TV. There's a colored show on TV because we identify with who we are. And so we should always, you know, I know we're getting towards the end, we should always try to promote positive statements when it comes to people of marginalized communities, because the children, you know, like I think DeGrace, who is I am terrible with people's names. He's down at he's an astronomer. DeGrace, you know who, a lot of you know who I'm talking about. He said he would have been an astronaut when he was, if he had seen other African Americans. Neil Tyson DeGrace, thank you. He said that he would, thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Ross.
That he would have become an astronaut if he had seen people like himself that were astronauts.
Yes, ma'am. No, it is important to show kids. This is why you see it on TV all the time, where they're saying, you know, now that we have not only an African American vice president, but a president that was present Asian, you know, because she's her mother's comes from the Philippines. So it's important for kids, especially younger ones, to see heroes, people that they can identify that looks like themselves.
Mhm.
You know, so
You
that's
know,
great.
there's going to be a time where, you know, people are going to be of all races. I mean, I can't tell you, in my family, it's very multicultural, and you know, yourself, that's.
No, thank you. Well, listen, I want to thank everyone. Miss Pamela, yes, just email me. We will send out proof of attendance. We will say, well, you know, if you need this, I know you say you have a certification in PA. So just email me. I put my email in the chat, Louise@800gambler.org. I don't want Ms. Neva's mailbox to be flooded because, as you know, Ms. Neva is our executive director and she's very busy. So, you know, I will deal that in. Ms. Neva, if you can make the presentation available to me, I'll make those who want it will get it.
Okay.
And I do want to thank everyone. And
Thank you.
We just remember that March is Problem Gambling Awareness Month. For every Friday of this month, we shall be holding other webinars. Okay. Next Friday will be Mr. Dan Toraro. He's our assistant director, and he will be presenting as well. I hope we will see you there at that presentation, and all the other Fridays for the rest of this month. Ms. Neva Pryor, thank you very much.
Thank you, Luis, and thanks to the whole team.
Thank you very much. And everyone, thank you for joining us. Have a great day, and hopefully I'll see you next week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye now.